My topic is about bridging the gap. And what I want to talk to you about is how are we going to create the places that we all need for tomorrow? How do we create them? How do we ensure that all the ingredients are in place? And it's partly to do because transgenerational is very, very important in terms of the kind of society that we are experiencing over the next 20 or 30 years. And it does require each one of us to be part of the place agenda. Now, we have a term that we coin called the placemakers. And often when we look around place, and I was delightful today to arrive at the railway station, walk across to a very new campus, which I know all around is still very beautiful greenfield sites. I'm quite sure that there's already the housing development being planned for the next 20 or so years to make it actually happening. However, how many of you have actually been involved in the discussion around that, in the designing of it, in the kind of requirements that you might want to see happening in the next 5 or 10 years' time as you move through the different stages? And that's really what I'm talking about. We're talking about place making rather than planning. We're talking about vision. We're talking about increasingly engaging with everybody in the place. The ingredients of a good place, I will talk you through the different stages, but most importantly, places are for people. They're not for the architects, they're not for the highway engineers, they're not for the transportation engineers, they are for people. So bear with me when I talk through the various sections there. The average life expectancy today of a baby born is 100 years old. Some of you will have seen probably the notion of Janet Street Porter recently, last week I think it was, where she lent her support to living better elder for people living to the age of 100. Now, it is quite clear that we have, on the one hand, an explosion in terms of older people, and at the same time we have, especially in the Western world, a decrease in the childbirth. So we are living with many more older people for much, much longer. And that brings very much challenges with it. And I will come back to the first speaker talks about Camp Hill, and it has a resonance with place as well, and I will come back to that. But it is with that in mind that we need to talk differently about our places, but we also need to involve more people in the decision making. And currently, very, very few people are involved when we're talking about 20 or so 30-year vision for the place. Very few people are actively involved in that kind of vision. Now, I have to say, in Scotland, we're just undergoing a review of the planning system. And it is quite interesting when we heard evidence of various people who are talking about where the houses of the future to go, where are the transportation, where is this. Very, very few people are actually involving themselves in the discussion until something is happening. And then it's often very negative. So we need to get away from that notion. We all are part of this active citizenship, and that means placemakers. The middle years are the very important ones. I was fascinated to hear that TED talk by that young girl, because young people are excluded from place decision making. And often the older generation, 65 plus, who have many more time on the hand, are involved in the placemaking agenda. But the middle years are very much absent, partly because they're economically very active, partly because maybe they have family commitments at both ends, young people needing to parenting, and also the older generation having to look after their next generation. So the middle years are absent from placemaking as well. What we want to see is more diverse voices coming into the place agenda. So how do we bridge the gaps between the young people excluded, not part of the discussion, the older people very much driving the civic agenda, and the middle years too busy with other things, and therefore not able to participate in the discussion? I think for me what's really, really important is, again, coming back to the review, Scotland is the first country that has actually asked for young people to be given a strategy role in the place agenda, i.e. in the planning system, to be consulted on, to be listened to, because, rightly so, young people live longest with the decision that we are making today. And as was said earlier by the speaker, young people are very much able to think out of the box. They're not bothered with property values. They're not bothered with infrastructure problems. They can just go on and find solutions. And so I think we need to get young people into the debate. So bridging the gaps is threefold. One is we need to address the kind of housing requirements we need for the future, bearing in mind what I said about an older aging population, but actively aging. We need to involve young people. And I'm leaving climate change off the agenda just for today because that is so massive, and I think it warrants another TED Talk. So we all hear about livable and good places, and we have statistics forever. The most livable cities are often seen as the most happiest places as well. And they're currently on an ongoing sort of index. But what I want to see is rather than having an index and a hierarchy, every place should be livable, should be a happy place, should involve citizens, should involve everyone around. So what we have at the moment is we're doing too many things the same way that we've always done. And then we are thinking we get different kinds of results. And of course we won't, because we're doing the same thing. So we're excluding the large majority of young people, we're excluding the middle bulge, and we're only involving young people as and when, maybe through schoolwork or whatever. So we need to start doing things differently. Thriving places need active citizens of all ages. Active citizens because in this day and age where we have a huge technology leap in terms of digitalization, in terms of being able to not having to wait for a public meeting in the middle of an evening when you really rather be at home in front of the television because you've had such a busy day. With digitalization, we can actually capture much more of the input of people. And that's what we need. We need active citizens. We also have, at the moment, we're running a pilot in Galashiels. Now, those of you who come from Scotland know Galashiels is a borders town and has just recently undergone the largest railway reopening in Europe, the Borders Railway. That place is changing hugely. What was once a historical town of textile industry and then slumped into the called multiple index of deprivation, it's slowly coming out again. What we're doing there with our 400 volunteers who are mainly from the planning profession and architects, we're working over a 4-year period with Education Scotland, Galashiels Academy, Scottish Borders Council, and various other community groups active in place to understand each other's notion about place. So what we do is we're working with S2 to S6, so 12-year-olds to 16-year-olds, for them to learn about how place functions, have their own ideas, using the Placemaker app that's coming out to stimulate the discussion, but also at the same time for young people to learn about the decision-making structures. That's the most important thing in a democracy, is about how and who and when do we make decisions, and who makes these decisions. And these young people are working with the elected members in Scottish Borders Council, they work with their community councils, they learn about what matters in this decision-making process. But it's not just one way, it's also the other way. So what we want to see is for young people to teach their older counterparts about the digital media around them, how to use your smartphone to then get into the place agenda discussion, how you get more savvy around your app. So it's a two-way street. It's really trying to build that intergenerational dialogue that is often so missing. And it doesn't take much. And what we're hoping in 4 years' time, that those 12-year-olds who then become 16 are going to fill their places on the community council, work with their peers, work with the older generation, together for the future of their place. That's what we would like to see. And the start is being made. And it's delightful to hear actually for the steering group, because it is obviously funded, so it has to have a steering group. The steering group will always meet in Galashiels, and it has young people on the steering group alongside Education Scotland, Creative Scotland, and the various other professionals. So that's the way, I think, to, in a way, change things around place. Don't ask the professional to do it to you. Somebody said that. We've got to do it together. The other thing that I would say in terms of the gap and the places that we need to create for tomorrow is about the pressure on homes. Most of you here are under the age of 25. there's some real challenges out there around the next house building stages. And we know in terms of what happens in London, we know that similar things happen in other cities. The pressure on what kind of homes we're building, who we're building it for, and of course, aligned to that is the explosion in the age population, which frees up some of the older houses, but only to pay for some of the much needed care costs, which is of course escalating. So pressure is really on a new kind of model. So there are other ways of building communities. And I want to talk about some of the examples that we have, for example, in Germany, in Tübingen. This is Tübingen. And what's happening there is it's very much Tübingen city, which is in the south of Germany, is the city itself acquires brownfield sites, parcels of brownfield sites, which it then hands over to cooperative housing associations. And these housing associations can be made up of communities of intent, like Camp Hill, or they can be made up of different families. But what they all have in common is the community that comes together to build maybe 5 or 6 units in one place is a community that wants to live together. There's a different tenures, mixed tenures. Some of them are rented, some of them are mortgaged. Others have, they're usually always on brownfield sites, and this has been going on since 1985. And what it has done, it has created a community that really is surrounded by shops, has built work spaces, and it really works. And the cost of that is, of course, a fraction to what you would get if you build it in a traditional model. But more importantly, just linking back to climate change, it is, of course, a community that is walkable, cyclable. You don't just build this monolithic estate at the outside of the city, further and further removing us from the services that we need. So, just a few statistics here. The over 65 age group is growing 4 times faster than the general population. That's just in the next 20 years. We're going to see a lot more older people, but they're active. So let's not forget that. They're not just going to go into care homes. They're going to be active for a lot longer. So what do we need for that? In 20 years' time, the number of people aged 80 and above will double, and the number of people over 90 will triple. That requires a very different approach to our homes and our places. So, we heard earlier about Camp Hill, which I thought was delightful because I'm a very keen advocate of co-housing, or as some people would call it, a community with intent, where people come together. Not far away from here in Scotland, we just built one, and that is in Portobello. A few people came together to build their own co-housing. Excellent. Often people say co-housing model comes from Denmark. It actually originated in Scotland, and it originated exactly in Camp Hill. The land was gifted by a landowner to the community who wanted to build for their disabled children a community that would look after them for in perpetuity. And that's what the owner of Camp Hill gave that land to it. Findhorn, which some of you may know, again, was another community of intent. They're all built on the same Rudolf Steiner principle of anthropology. It is really important. Of course, Findhorn has made itself a name as a very green and designer-led and sustainable place. We have lost, to some extent in Scotland, that notion of building co-housing. And we should have more, I think, ambition, because this is exactly what the older, faster aging population requires. It combats loneliness. It increases neighborliness. Loneliness is going to be the largest killer over the next few years on 2 fronts. One, because it speeds up, I think, by 64% dementia. And at the same time, obviously, if you're a lonely person, you don't really feel inspired by anything. And it does help to have build a kind of places that encourages neighborliness. But actually also in place, we have a lot of towns and cities that have lots and lots of parcels of brownfield site, ideally suited to build these small co-housing, 6 to 7 units. In Sweden, in Germany, in the Netherlands, about 20% of all housing stock, new build, is co-housing. And that is the future that we need to embrace. And it needs to be had by, this discussion has to be had by everybody. So I started off with what are the ingredients of place. In order to reach social equity, in order to have that social equity, I would say the challenge is to bring in all the voices, the seldom heard voices, whether that's young people, the active middle group, or whether it's further out, people that are coming to Scotland from whatever culture who want to live and work here. We have to bring everybody together. The other ingredients of a good place is, of course, kind of respect and the trust that we want to work together and understanding differences, but actually acknowledging that difference is good. And finally, cater for the different needs, all of our needs. And again, that brings it back. If we look at co-housing, one of the interesting aspects of co-housing is it's also a housing that can be adapted. So if you build more off-site construction, for example, rather than the traditional housing building model, off-site construction can help us to bring the costs down, reduce the waste. 52% of Scotland's waste, 52% is construction waste, so we need to start looking at things differently. But also, in a way, make sure that we have an energy-efficient home that will help people as they grow through different ages and can be adopted. So the challenge, I think, for all of us is to be more active in place, find out where your development plan sits right now, be involved in place, and feel free, and feel free to contact my organization to say, I want to know a little bit more how I can get involved in that. Thank you.